Okay. Okay, we're recording. I'm going to talk to you today about the first major collection of scriptures in the Buddhist tradition, which is known in the West as the Pali Canon because it was written down in the Pali language. I'm going to go into that with you and the story behind that. Really, when we're looking at these ancient histories of these religious traditions and philosophical traditions, I find not only as a scholar, but particularly as a teacher, that really the only way to do it, to get the chronology and the history right, is to learn about the literature, the sources. In a sense, ancient history really just is the history of the sources that we have, finding out about it. So when approaching learning Asian philosophy and religion, and by the way, I was already a professor and doing other things. And the university that I worked for, my good friend who'd been teaching Asian philosophy and religion retired, and things being what they are these days, they weren't going to. This was a long time ago now, over 10 years ago. I don't know, but they weren't going to get anybody else, and so I said, well, I'll do it. And so I took over that class and started to learn myself. And as I said, learning about this stuff to me works a lot about learning about the about the scriptural sources. So let us do then as we do, and we will go to no, not that. For heaven's sakes, you guys! I'm such a technical whiz, aren't I, people? We're going to look at the. Oh, shut up! We're going to look at the Pali Canon. The Pali Canon, early Buddhist scripture, the scripture of Theravada Buddhism. I'm going to talk about what that means. There's lots of sort of loose talk about the difference between Theravada and Mahayana, so that's something I like to clear up. So the origins of the Pali Canon. Remember the Buddha Siddhartha Gautama living in the 5th century, the 400s, the same century as Pericles in Athens, I always like to point out. And the first Buddhist council, there were 4 Buddhist councils. The last one was in the end of the 1st century BCE, during the time of the rise of the Caesars in Rome. The first one, shortly after the death of the Buddha, around 400 BC, around the beginning of the 4th century. The year before the execution of Socrates in Athens, by the way, I would point out. So those were written down. And then we already had our last lesson about King Ashoka, and King Ashoka, with that canon, with all those teachings that had been collected, he then was able to organize missionaries. And so historically, what Theravada Buddhism really means is it's just the old original Buddhism that King Ashoka sent out to Indochina. Again, that's Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. And then also by way of Sri Lanka, formerly Ceylon, the large island off the southeast coast of India. And those countries, those Indo-Chinese countries and Sri Lanka, are Buddhist countries to this day, Theravadan Buddhist countries. But again, we'll talk about what Mahayana means when we get to Mahayana in a lesson or two. But really, it's overstated that there's a difference between Theravada and Mahayana. The Theravada, the Pali Canon of Theravada Buddhism contains all the basic teachings of the Buddha Dharma, and these teachings are the same across all of Buddhism, including the Mahayana Buddhist tradition that we'll talk about after we get done with this. I want to talk about those Talipot palm trees for a while. I'm going to give you a link. We had a Talipot palm tree here on campus. It's got the largest efflorescence in the world. It was down by the old track across the street from the brewery. It's gone now. But I'm going to give you a link so you can look at that. The Talipot palm, no one knows of any wild stands of Talipot palms. They are only associated with Buddhism and with human Buddhist activity. There are no known wild Talipot palms. Nobody even knows where they came from geographically originally, because they enter history as these palm trees that are planted around Buddhist monasteries. And the Pali Canon, which is in the Pali language, the language of Sri Lanka, It's a language of southern India at the time. In Sri Lanka right now, the Sinhalese ethnic majority are the Buddhist people there. So they scratched it into these talipot leaves and then dried them. And there are these beautiful boxes of these dried talipot leaves with the Pali Canon inscribed on them that are collector's items. And so we had one of those, and it bloomed. They only bloom. They live about 80 years, and then they efflorescence. So they have their flowers, and then they die. And we watched it. And I'll look, and I think I have some old Facebook pictures someplace, and I'll see if I can somehow. There's a link about that. So anyway, the talipot palm thing is kind of cool as far as all of this is concerned. So that's why we have it, because it was very difficult to destroy those leaves. Really, basically. Okay, so covered all that. And again, here you see, notice this Theravada in the yellow here, and that's 3rd century BCE, as I'm saying, right? That's the 400, that'd be the 200s there. Shortly after that turn of the century. And this CE you see in the north is the Common Era. That's after the time of Christ. So again, historically, the difference is that Theravada went out there very early on, hundreds and hundreds of years before Tibet got socially engineered into Buddhism, sometime starting around the 5th century of the Common Era, and Bodhidharma earlier than that crossed over the mountains into China sometime in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. Okay, so the Pali Canon, what you call it in Pali or in Sanskrit, is the Tripitaka. So Pitaka means basket, and the legend is that the palm leaves were kept in these baskets, and so you get the Tripitaka, the 3 baskets. And in the other sense of that, Tripitaka is the 3 baskets of gifts, the 3 baskets of wonderful fruit for everyone. Remember that structure of the Vedas, they had different layers and different parts, and the Pali Canon is that way too. It's a tripartite thing. The Vinaya has rules of conduct for the Sangha. The Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. If you decide that you want to become a Buddhist, which is very easy since you don't have to renounce anything else, you just say that you seek refuge. That's the phrase that's used in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Buddha himself, the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, and the Sangha is the community. And as I say, Buddha is a community organizer. So rules of conduct of the Sangha. Then the Sutta Pitaka, again, Sutta or Sutta in Pali, in Sanskrit, Sutra, are just teachings. This is the biggest part of it. It's a lot of sayings, and it's a compilation of a lot of sayings and teachings of the Buddha, supposedly. And then the Abhidhamma school is a school with its roots in Hindu philosophy that becomes attached to Buddhism. But again, it's a metaphysical system having to do with dharmas that isn't really what Siddhartha Gautama does, but that it is part of developing Buddhist philosophy. There is Buddhist philosophy of metaphysics, and we're going to get to that. That's part of the fun stuff. Okay. Here's a monk showing us some of the Pali Canon, and as I say, there are also these beautiful little boxes of talipot palm plants that you can get. The Dhammapada is probably the most famous part of the Tripitaka. It is, as I say, a collection of axioms. Buddhism's really good for sort of inspirational thinking and thought of the day kind of stuff, because it is an orally transmitted tradition. It's also a tradition that aims at working on sort of conduct. And it's also a tradition that very self-consciously aims at reaching ordinary people and doesn't make itself esoteric or difficult to reach. So Buddhist literature on that level is very accessible indeed. Like all ancient scriptures, when you actually get to the original sources, there's a lot of repetition and strange stuff that makes it a little bit more cumbersome. But these collections of sayings and axioms are very popular, and you can see why. The Dhammapada is, as I say, probably the most famous one of them. I'm going to give you some of that. It's organized into chapters by topic. So let's just chew on these. We don't have to go fast. I'll just leave it up there so you can read it. All that we are is the result of what we have thought. Actually, even, and we'll get into this more because I want to do a little bit more philosophical stuff in the time that we have left this semester. But one of the really interesting things about Buddhist philosophy is that they really don't have this mind-body distinction of the sort of inner mind and outer body, this inner-outer thing, that we have so much that it's really hard for us even to imagine what it is not to have that. So a big trick in trying to understand Buddhist philosophy and a lot of Asian philosophy, Chinese philosophy like this too, is that we have to think our way out of or sort of deprogram ourselves from this Cartesian way of thinking that there's sort of, we're kind of up in our heads, this little detached mind looking out at the world. On this more holistic kind of philosophical view, there's a much more dynamic connection between what's happening in the world and what's happening in your mind. Again, there is not such a distinction. And ultimately, that does go to your notion of the self, by the way, as you would think. So again, karma. If a man speaks or acts with an evil thought, pain follows him. It's just not the negative thoughts and feelings in your mind are in your mind. You might think they're about somebody else, but you're the one walking around with it. All that we are is the result of what we have thought. And again, we can take that as rhetoric, but in this tradition, that is really a much more literal thought, and trying to get to that sort of literalness of it is part of appreciating some of the depths of it. Okay, hatred does not cease by hatred at any time. Hatred ceases by love. This is an eternal rule. The whole thing about the wheel of karma, always with Hinduism too, is you get off it. And so that's always there, that kind of breaking the cycle. And that's also another version of the idea that you have the Buddha Dharma inside of you. And I think for contemporary people, one of the most powerful parts of Buddhist teaching is about craving and the cycle of craving and satisfaction, dealing with addictions and obsessions, and really just repetitive thoughts, because the first thing that you're going to notice when you do some meditating is that your thoughts are just repeating themselves over and over, and that's sort of the essence of craving right there. The life of those beings with minds bent on happiness flows like oil mixed with water, seeking out the streams of pleasure but caught in the oil of birth and old age. Because it's exactly when we try and immerse ourselves in carnal happiness that we become most intimately connected with our mortal selves. Well, not necessarily all bad, I guess. Beings led by craving circle like rabbits caught in a snare, fettered completely, so you get the picture. That's pretty basic. Spiders in their own webs, but you can slip out of the suffering. The third and fourth of the Four Noble Truths. And again, what happens in the cycle-dependent arising, of course, is ego. If a man make himself as he teaches others to be, then being himself well subdued, one's own self is indeed difficult to subdue. Solidarity starts at home, and it's not about teaching other people. It's about taming your own mind. Meditation is about taming your mind. You start to meditate, you see how crazy your mind is, but maybe just disorderly. Maybe it's just disorderly. But in any event, getting it more under control. You in control of your thoughts and feelings, and not the thoughts and feelings in control of you. So, it's what we're calling ego here, almost in a sense, isn't you. The evil done by oneself crushes the foolish. I think that's important. It's sort of like on King of the Hill, is that it? That show about those guys down in Texas, or they hang out by the trash cans drinking beer all the time. It's like you already threw yourself so far off any kind of good path that the idea that sort of bad things or capricious things that happen to you by some other reason or really any factor at all is almost ridiculous. By oneself, the evil is done, and by oneself, one suffers. That's the thing. The suffering is kind of private, you know. By oneself, evil is left undone. By oneself, one is purified. You do it yourself. Purity and impurity belong to oneself, and no one can purify another. And that's, I mean, I mentioned that. Is there anyone? There's something. One last thing, and I'll stop. I mentioned that the Buddha was kind of sort of like a Protestant reformer in that Hindu tradition. I mean, he wanted to break some of the fatalistic and kind of very conservative effects of the structure of traditional Hindu notions of karma and reincarnation. And so that's part of what you need to understand to see what sort of Buddhism's kind of all about, or what the Buddha Dharma is kind of all about. So, so that. So the Pali Canon, lots and lots of stuff to look at in the Pali Canon, lots and lots of stuff to look at in the Buddha, the Dhammapada. You can get a very nice edition of the Dhammapada. Here I got one with the Sanskrit on one side and the English on the other. You can see that. So anyway, the Pali Canon. Yes, indeedy. And I shall talk to you on, well, actually today's Thursday, but I will talk to you tomorrow on Friday. Okay, so that's that.